The Saffron Robe by Tuesday Lovesang Rampa. Read to you by BlueFriend. January 2017. This is Chapter 7. A deep droning buzz penetrated my sleeping mind. Somewhere nearby, very much thought power was being poured out onto the receptive air. My telepathic powers were stirred. I lifted my nodding head and tiredly opened my drooping eyelids. I was tired. A slight stir on my lap, and a loving mouth took a gentle grip of my hand and squeezed with affection. "Purr, purr," said the old guardian cat. He looked up at me with deep understanding. The faint flicker of a butter lamp reflected blood red from eyes that were sky blue by daylight. Softly, so softly that I was aware of it only after he had left, the cat slid from my lap and merged with the palpable shadows. Oh, my legs were stiff. The scarce-healed bones felt as if they were grating. The tight, deep burn scar gave the impression that it would at any moment peel away from the flesh to leave again a raw and gaping wound. Waves of pain shot up my limbs and twirled fierce talons of pain along my spine, threatening to tear my ribs from their seatings. I lay still, gasping. As the spasm slowly faded, I cautiously looked about me. Here, in the deep purple shadow of the great sacred figure, I could see, unseen. The windows were outlined as dark rectangles on a wall of dancing shadows. Through the glassless frames, I could see the night sky as a black pall of smoothest velvet sprinkled with bright jewels of light. Diamonds, rubies, and turquoise dots twinkled and swirled above. Here, in the high, thin air of Tibet, stars were seen in color, not like white specks of light as in the lower planes of the world. Here there were no rolling clouds of smoke to sully the purity of the sky and obscure the grandeur of the heavens. Mars was red, a pale ruby. Venus was green, while the little speck of Mercury was as a splinter of turquoise. Faint finger marks as of finely crushed diamond dust stretched in a band as far as I could see. Tonight there was no moon to compete with and swamp the feeble starlight. On the walls the shadows leaped and postured, now beings of giant figures stretched out to the roof, now squat dwarfs scrabbling on the floor. Off to the side, near me, a butter lamp was damaged. From its battered bottom there came a gluck, gluck, as melted butter seeped out, and then splat, as the congealing liquid spattered on the floor. Again, a distant wall by the side of a window, a tanka fluttered almost as though there was a moth straining to reach the flickering flames. It clattered slightly as it bulged away from the wall, vibrated, and then sank back as exhausted, only to repeat again and again. For a moment I had what was almost an attack of vertigo. I had awakened suddenly from sleep, and now as I looked about, the shadows moving and writhing and twisting, and the different cadences of the voices at the other side of the sacred figure, it rather bemused me. I looked up at the back of the head of the great figure behind which I was crouched. For a moment I felt panic. The figure was toppling. It was going to fall on me and crush me. The outlines wavered, and I got ready to throw myself sideways, hampered as I was by my damaged legs. But suddenly I almost laughed out loud. It was the illusion of life through the flickering of the shadows. By now the pain had somewhat subsided. I got on my hands and knees and softly crept around the edge of the figure so that I could peer into this, one of the innermost of the temples. I had never seen a service in this temple before. We boys were rigidly excluded. For us it was the main temple, or one of the more common of the minor temples. But this, hollowed in the rock far beneath the man-made structure, I wondered what it was, what they were doing here. Cautiously I pulled my robe around my waist so that I should not trip over it. I edged forward and peered round the corner. This was interesting, I thought. In front of me, in a circle, were 9 lamas, all in their saffron robes, all with their heads facing the center of the circle. And in the center, upon an ornately carved stand, was something which I could not clearly distinguish. There seemed to be something, and yet there seemed to be nothing there. I shivered, and the shaven hair of my head stood rigidly erect, like guards on parade, for the chill fingers of fear had reached out and touched me, stimulating me so that I was ready to flee. I thought that on the carved stand stood a creature from the shadow world, a creature which had no real existence in this, our world, and hardly any existence in the other world from whence it came. I stared and stared. It seemed to be a globe of something, or a globe of nothing. It seemed to be almost without form, and yet what form there was rippled. I wish I could go closer, peer over the head of one of the seated lamas, but that would be sure detection. So I sat back and rubbed my hands into my eyes, trying to wipe away sleep, trying to make them more alert, trying to make them see better in this haze and gloom. Satisfied that I had done as much as I could to my eyes, I crouched forward again on hands and knees and stared, shifting my position slightly to get a better view between the shoulders of 2 lamas. I saw, it occurred to me suddenly, that this was an enormous rock crystal, flawless, perfect. It reposed upon its carved stand and commanded the attention of the lamas, who sat almost in devotion before it. They eyed it intently, and yet not so intently as to engage their physical eyes, but instead it seemed to be a use of the third eye. Well, I thought, I too am clairvoyant. So I stared no more with my eyes, but instead let my clairvoyant faculties come into play. And in the crystal I saw colors, swirls, whorls, and a smoky turbulence. Amazingly, frighteningly, I seemed to be falling from an immense height, falling from the top of the world down into an abyss. But no, it was not an abyss. Instead, a world was stretching out in front of me, a world where there were different colors, different standards. I saw, as from slight eminence, people wandering about, full of misery, full of sadness. Some were full of pain. They were lost souls, souls without guidance, souls pondering on a method of release from their worries. As I sat there, entranced, as though I were on the sunlit plain of a different world, the chants of the lamas droned on. Every so often one would reach out a hand and ring a silver bell. Another opposite would do the same with a different tone of bell. And so they would go on with their chants, their music sliding up and down the scale, not in notes staccato, as in other pans of the world, but here a glissade of notes, sliding one into the other, merging into chords which echoed from the walls and reverberated and made chords of their own. The leader of the Lama group clapped his hands, the one next to him rang a bell, and the third of the group lifted up his voice in a ritualistic chant, Om, listen, the voices of our souls. And so they went on from one to the other, repeating the age-old stanzas, first one at a time, then in unison, the cadence of their voices rising and falling, lifting me out of time, out of myself. Then came the whole set of prayers of this group, like this. Oh, listen to the voice of our souls, all you who cower in the wilderness unprotected. Listen to the voice of our souls, that we may protect the unprotected. As the first stick of incense is lit and the smoke rises upward, let your soul and your faith rise also, that you may be protected. Oh, listen to the voice of our souls, all you who cringe with fear in the night. Listen to the voice of our souls, for we will be as a lantern glowing in the darkness, that we may guide benighted wayfarers. As the second stick of incense is lit and glows with life, let your soul perceive the light we shine, that you may be guided. Oh, listen to the voice of our souls, all you who are stranded at the gulf of ignorance. Listen to the voice of our souls. Our help shall be as a bridge to cross the chasm, to assist you farther on the path. As the third stick of incense is lit and the smoke trails, let your soul step forth bravely into light. Oh, listen to the voice of our souls, all you who are faint with the weariness of life. Listen to the voice of our souls, for we bring you rest. That rested your soul shall sally forth anew. As the fourth stick of incense is lit and the smoke idly drifts, we bring rest, that refreshed you may rise renewed. Oh, listen to the voice of our souls, all you who scoff at holy words. Listen to the voice of our souls. We bring you peace, that you may dwell upon immortal truths. As the fifth stick of incense is lit to bring fragrance of life, open your mind, that you may know. The sound of the chanting died away. A lama raised his bell and tinkled it softly. Others picked up their bells and tinkled them. First they all rang separately, and then, according to some prearranged pattern, they all rang out together, forming a special tone scheme which echoed and reverberated and varied in pitch and intensity. The lamas continued their deep droning, repeating again, "Oh, listen to the voice of our souls," ringing their bells, droning on. The effect was hypnotic and mystical. I continued to look at the people about me, or were they about me? Was I in some other world? Or was I looking in a crystal? My strong impression was that I was in another world, where the grass was greener, where the sky was bluer, where everything stood out in sharp, vivid contrast. There was the green sward beneath my feet, good gracious, I could feel it with my bare toes. I could feel moisture seeping through my robe where my knees were in contact. My hands, too, as I gently scuffed them, seemed to feel grass, and perhaps here and there a stone or two. I looked about me with avid interest. There were great boulders in the foreground of a greenish stone, here and there streaked with white veins. Other boulders were of different colors. One, to which I was particularly attracted, was of a reddish hue, reddish with milk-white strands running through it. But what impressed me most was the manner in which everything stood out with stark reality. The manner in which everything looked more normal than normal, with brighter colors, sharper outlines. There was a gentle breeze blowing. I could feel it above my left cheek. It was rather astonishing because it bore upon it strange scents, exotic odors. Some distance away I saw something that looked like a bee. It was buzzing along, and it landed and entered the trumpet of a little flower growing in the grass. All this I saw without consciously being aware of the passage of time. But then I became alarmed, wary, for there was a whole group of people coming my way. I looked at them and I was powerless to move. They were coming towards me, and I was more or less in their path. Here, as I looked at them, I sensed something very much amiss. Some of the people were old people who leaned upon sticks and who hobbled along barefooted, clad in tattered rags. Others were obviously men of wealth, but not with the general air of well-being which affluence usually brings, for one thing stood out particularly about these men and women. They were miserable, frightened. The slightest move made them jump and clasp their hands across their breasts. They looked nervously about them, and not one seemed to be aware of his neighbor. They seemed to feel that they were alone, forgotten, desolate, and abandoned in some alien world. They came on, each one an individual, aware only of his own existence, and yet they came in a group, no one touching the other, no one aware of the presence of the other. They came on, lured by the voices which I too could hear. Oh, listen to the voice of our souls, all you who wander unguided. The chant and the droning went on, and the people came on also, and as they came to a certain spot, I could not actually see what was happening. Each face lit up with a sort of unearthly joy. Each person stood more erect as if he or she received an assurance and felt the better therefore. They moved along out of my sight. Suddenly there was a clash of bells and dissonance, and I felt a violent jerk within me, as if someone was reeling me in, as if I was a kite at the end of a string being drawn in against a gale which tried to loft it further. As I looked out upon that strange landscape, I had the impression that night was falling, for the sky was darkening and the colors were becoming less distinguishable. Things seemed to be shrinking. Shrinking? How could they shrink? But undoubtedly they were shrinking, and not only were they becoming smaller, but a fog like the clouds above was beginning to cover the face of that world, and as my horrified gaze took in the scene, getting smaller and smaller in the fog, changed into black thunder clouds shot with lightning. The world was getting smaller and smaller, and I was rising upwards and upwards. As I looked down, I could see it rotating beneath my feet, and then I decided, of course, it was not rotating beneath my feet because I was on my hands and knees in the temple. Or where was I? I was confused and dazed, and then once again came that sharp, terrific jerk, a jerk which nearly spun my brain out of my head. Quite dizzy for the moment, I raised my hands to rub my eyes, and then I gazed again, and I saw before me that the crystal was just a crystal once again. No longer a world, just a crystal, lying dull and lifeless, with no point of light within it. It stood upon its carved base as though it were a stone or an idol or anything, not as the most wonderful instrument of wonderful experiences. Slowly, a lama rose to his feet and took from the base a cloth. It looked like black velvet. Reverently, he unfolded the cloth and draped it over the crystal, and then tucked it in. He bowed 3 times in the direction of the crystal and turned away to resume his seat. As he did so, his astonished gaze fell upon me. For some seconds there was a stunned, shocked silence. Time itself seemed to have been paralyzed. I could just hear my heart give one loud thump, and then no more. There was an impression that the whole of nature, the whole of time, was listening in hushed suspense to see what would happen next. There was a mutter between the lamas. The one nearest me stood up and towered over me. He was the biggest of the lot, but to my terrified eyes he looked bigger than the patella itself. He towered over me and started to speak, but then another lama recognized me. "It's Mingyar's boy, Lobsang," he said, rather relieved. "This is our most telepathic boy. Bring him here." The giant lama reached down and put his hands beneath my arms and lifted me up, for being told that I was Mingyar's boy had given him the knowledge that I could not easily walk, and so he saved me that trouble. He carried me into the circle of the lamas, each one looking at me as if they were going to peer into my soul, as if they were going to peer through my soul, beyond and into other realms leading to the Overself. I was in a considerable state of fright because I did not know that I had done anything particularly wrong. I had chosen this particular temple because some of the others were always thronged by small boys who were not seriously interested in meditation. I was. But what was that? "Lobsang," said a small, wizened lama, "what were you doing here?" "Honorable Master," was my reply, "it has long been my habit to come to the minor temples for private meditation, and I sit behind one of the sacred figures where I cannot disturb anyone else who is meditating. I had no thought of intruding upon your service. In fact," I looked rather shamefaced, "I fell asleep, and I was only awakened when I heard your service about to start." Off to the left, the leaking butter lamp had ceased its splat splat, and suddenly there came a short hiss as the floating wick, now deprived of liquid butter, expired and was extinguished against the metal. For seconds it smoldered red, and then there was the acrid, rancid smell of charring wick. From outside our circle came a familiar purr, purr. Friend Cat importantly pushed his way between the 2 lamas, walked to me with tail erect, and butted me in friendship. I reached out a trembling hand and riffled my fingers through his fur. He turned to me, gave another butt and said, "Prrr," and sedately stalked off, pushing his way between two more llamas. The llamas looked at each other, and a faint smile played across their lips. "So, our guardian here knows you well, Lobsang. He spoke well for you, too. He assured you of his devotion and told us that you had spoken the truth." For a few moments there was silence. One of the younger llamas turned his head and saw the cat haughtily stalking away. He chuckled and turned back to the group. The old wizened lama, who seemed to be very much of the senior and who was in charge of the service, looked at me, then turned to each of his fellows, remarking, "Yes, I remember. This is the boy who has to have special instruction. We were waiting for the return of his guide before summoning him here, but as he is here, let us test his experience and his capabilities so that we may assess him without the influence of his powerful guide." There was a murmured agreement and low-voiced suggestions which I was far too confused to follow. These were the high telepathic lamas, the high clairvoyants, the ones who helped others, and now I was sitting with them, sitting shivering with fright, it is true, but still sitting with them. One of them turned to me and said, "Lobsang, we have heard so much about you, about your innate powers, about your possibilities, and about your future. In fact, it is we who investigated the record of probabilities to see what would happen in your case. Now, are you willing to undergo some ordeal in order that we may determine the extent of your powers? We want to take you for a walk in the astral and in the world below the astral. We want to take you, as a ghost, through our potala." I looked at him dubiously. Take? How did they think I could walk? I could hobble about the corridors, but my legs were not yet healed enough to enable me to walk with any degree of confidence. I hesitated, thought about it, and twisted the hem of my robe, and then I replied, "Honorable masters, I am very much in your power, but I have to say that I'm not able to walk much because of my accidents. But as a good monk should, I place myself at your disposal, hoping that my guide, the Lama Mingyar Dondap, would approve of my decision." No one laughed or even smiled at what must have sounded to be a very pompous statement, for I was young and inexperienced, and after all I was doing my best, and who can do more than one's best? "Lobsang, we want you to lie prone. We have to have you prone because your legs will not permit you to be in the orthodox position. Therefore, you must lie prone." The old lama carefully took a seat cushion and placed it beneath my head. Then he placed my hands with fingers clasped so that my two hands with fingers entwined were between the end of the breastbone and the umbilicus. Then they rearranged themselves. They shifted the crystal to one side, reverently placing it in a place that I had not previously noticed, in the base of a sacred figure. They sat about me so that my head was in the exact center of the circle. One lama broke away from the group and returned with sticks of incense and a small brazier. I almost disgraced myself by sneezing as a trailing cloud of smoke crossed my face and made my nostrils itch. Strangely, my eyes were getting heavy. I had a sense of increasing lassitude, but the lamas were not looking at me. They were looking at a point far above me. I forced open my eyes, and I could see under their chins. I could see up into their nostrils. Their heads were so far tilted that I could not distinguish their eyes. No, they were not looking at me. They were looking where? The incense smoldered on, making a small sizzling noise which I had not noticed before. Suddenly I clutched my hands even more tightly, because the whole building seemed to be rocking. I had heard of earthquakes, and I thought that suddenly we of the Potala were being afflicted with an earthquake. Panic welled up within me, and by great effort I managed to suppress it, thinking that it would be a disgrace to my guide if I scrambled to my feet and scuttled out of the temple while lamas sat placidly on. The swaying continued, and for a moment I felt almost sick. For a moment I felt that I was drifting up. I found that one of the beams of the roof was a few inches from my hand. Idly I put my hand out to ward myself off, and to my terror my hand went right through the beam, not even disturbing the dust which lay upon its surface. With the terror of that experience, I sank down rapidly and landed on my feet by the side of a sacred figure. Quickly I put my hand out to steady myself, knowing that my legs would not support me, but again my hands went right through the sacred figure, and my legs felt firm and strong. I had no pain, no discomfort. I turned quickly. The group of lamas was still there. But no, one was absent. He was, I perceived, standing beside me, and his hand was about to touch my elbow. He appeared bright. He appeared rather larger than the others, and when I looked at the sacred figure, I found that I, too, was a bit larger than was my normal state. Again, a great knot of fear seemed to be inside me, and my stomach churned with fright. But the Lama took my elbow, reassuring me with, "It's all right, Lobsang. There is nothing for you to fear. Come with me." He led the way with his hand on my right elbow. Carefully, we skirted the lamas still sitting in a circle. I looked in the center of the circle, but my body was not there. There was nothing there. Carefully, I felt myself, and I felt solid. Surreptitiously, I reached out and touched the lama beside me, and he was solid too. He saw my gesture and laughed and laughed. "Lobsang, Lobsang, you are now in a different state completely with your body. Only those with the greatest occult ability, inborn ability, can do such a thing as that. But come with me." We walked on to the side of the temple, and the wall came closer and closer. I withdrew from his grasp and tried to turn aside, exclaiming, "No, we shall hurt ourselves unless we stop. The wall is solid." The Lama regained his grip on me and commanded, "Come along. When you have more experience, you will discover how simple this is." He moved behind me and put his hands between my shoulder blades. The wall loomed ahead, a solid wall of grey stone. He pushed, and truly the most remarkable sensation of my life came upon me as I entered the stone of the wall. It seemed as if my whole body was tingling. It seemed as if millions, billions of bubbles were bouncing against me, not impeding me, just tickling me, just making my hair stand on end, just making me itch pleasantly. I seemed to be moving without any difficulty whatever, and as I looked I had the impression that I was moving through a dust storm. But the dust was not hurting me. It was not troubling my eyes at all, and I put out my hands and I tried to grasp some of that dust. But it went through me, or I went through it. I do not know which is correct. The Lama behind me chuckled and pushed a little harder, and I broke right through the wall and into the corridor beyond. An old man was coming down the corridor, carrying a butter lamp in each hand, and carrying something pressed between his left elbow and his body. I tried to avoid contact with him, but it was too late. Immediately I was set to apologize for my clumsiness, but the old man went on. He had walked right through me, or I had walked through him, and neither of us was aware of the contact. Neither had the slightest impression that we'd just walked through another human. With the Lama guiding me, we moved through the building, never intruding upon the privacy of others alone in their rooms, but instead visiting storerooms, and a rather caustic comment or gesture on the part of the Lama, who knew me so well, we visited the kitchen. The old cook-monk was there, resting against a great leather container of barley. He was scratching at himself and picking at his teeth with a piece of stalk from somewhere. Ever so often he would turn and spit in the corner, and then get back to his scratching and tooth-picking. Eventually, as we stood watching him, he turned around, gave a hearty sigh, and said, Aye, time to prepare the food again, I suppose. What a life is this! Sampa, Sampa, and yet more Sampa, and all these hungry people to fill. We moved on and on through the building. My legs did not trouble me at all. In fact, to be truthful about it, I did not even think about my legs, for there was no reason that I should. They didn't disturb me. We were very careful not to invade the privacy of another person. We turned the corridors as much as we could so as not to enter any individual living space. We came deep down into the storerooms. Outside there was my old friend, Honorable Puss-Puss, lying stretched out full length on his side, twitching slightly. His whiskers were quivering and his ears were flat upon his head. We were approaching soundlessly, we thought, but suddenly he awoke to full alertness and sprang to his feet, bristling with bared fangs. But then his eyes went crossed as he looked at the astral plane, as all cats can, and he started to purr as he recognized me. I tried to pat him, but of course my hand went right through him. A most remarkable experience, for I often patted old Honorable Puss-Puss, and never before had my hand gone inside. He seemed as amused as I was distressed, but he just gave a butt at me, which went through me to his surprise this time, and then he dismissed the whole thing from his mind, laid down, and he went to sleep again. For a long time we wandered through solid walls, rising up through floors, and then at last the Lama said, Down again, let us go down, for we have journeyed far enough on this occasion. He took my arm, and we sank down through a floor, appearing from the ceiling beneath, and through another floor, until we came to the corridor, off which the temple lay. Once again we approached the wall, but this time I had no hesitation. I walked right through it, rather reveling in the strange sensation of all those bubbles coming, all that pleasant tickling. Inside, the Lamas were still in their circle, and my Lama, the one who was holding my arm, told me that I should lie down in the position I originally occupied. I did so, and on the instant Sleep came upon me. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Somewhere a bell was tolling. Muted at first by distance, it rapidly grew in volume. Clang, clang, it went. Strange, I thought, a bell? Good gracious, it's tolling in time with my heartbeat. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm me. Had I overslept and been late for temple service? Blearily, I opened my eyes and tried to see where I was. This was strange. I couldn't focus. All I could discern was 9 horrible white blobs stuck on the top of saffron streaks. My brain creaked with the effort of thought. Where was I? What happened? Had I fallen off a roof or something? Drearily, I became aware that there were various aches and pains surging back into my consciousness. Oh, yes. It all came back with a rush, and with the knowledge came the ability to focus my eyes and see what was before me. I was lying on my back on the stone-cold floor. My bowl had somehow slipped from front to back in my robe and was now supporting my weight between my shoulder blades. My barley bag of hard leather had worked down and was almost breaking my left ribs. Touchily, I moved and stared up at the 9 llamas sitting watching me. They were the horrible white blobs stuck on saffron streaks. I hoped that they did not know what I had thought. Yes, Labsang, we do know, smiled one. Your telepathic thoughts were very clear on the subject, but rise slowly. You've done well and fully justified your guide's remarks. Gingerly I sat up, receiving a hearty butt in the back and a roaring purr as I did so. The old cat came round to face me and touched my hand as a sign that he wanted his fur ruffled. Idly I did so as I collected my scattered wits and wondered what would happen next. Well, Labsang, that was a good experience of getting out of the body, said the Lama who had accompanied me. We must try it often, so that you can get out of your body as easily as shrugging off your robe. But, Honorable Lama, I said in some confusion, I did not leave my body. I took it with me. The Lama guide's jaw dropped in astonishment. What do you mean? He exclaimed. You traveled in spirit with me. Honorable Lama, was my rejoinder, I looked specially, and my body was not on the floor, so I must have taken it with me. The old wizened Lama, the smallest of the 9, smiled and said, You're making a common mistake, Labsang, for you are still bemused by the senses. I looked at him, and quite honestly I did not know what he was talking about. It seemed to me that he had taken leave of his senses, for, I thought, surely I should know if I saw my own body or not, and if I did not see my body, then it must not have been there. I suppose they must have seen by my skeptical glance that I was not taking in what they were saying, what they were implying, because one of the other lamas motioned for me to pay attention. I'm going to give you my version of it, Labsang, said this other lama, and I want you to pay close attention, for what I have to say is elementary, yet it is a matter which puzzles a lot of people. You were lying on the floor, and as this was your first conscious time of astral traveling, we helped you. We helped ease your astral form out of your physical form. And because it was done by us, who have a lifetime of experience, you did not feel any jolt or any disturbance. Wherefore it is clear that you had no idea that you were out of the body. I looked at him and thought about it. I thought, yes, that's right. I had no idea that I was out of the body. No one had said I was going to be out of the body. So if they hadn't told me what to expect, how could I have a feeling of leaving the body? But then it all came back to me that I had looked down and I had not seen my body lying on the floor as surely as I should have done unless I was still in my body. I shook my head as if to shake the cobwebs loose. I felt that all this was getting too deep for me. I was out of the body, yet my body wasn't there. So if it wasn't there, where was it? And why hadn't I seen it lying about somewhere? Just then the old cat gave me another butt and started knitting and kneading, bumping up and down on my lap, sinking his claws into my robe and purring louder and louder, reminding me that I must stay aware of his presence also. The Lama, who had been speaking, laughed as he remarked, "There, old cat is telling you to scrape your brains clear so that you may perceive." I spread my fingers and raked the cat's back. His purrs increased in volume. Then suddenly he just flopped down at length. He was a big old thing. His head was sticking over one side of my lap, and his legs were protruding over the other side, with his tail stretched straight out on the floor. These cats grew larger than the average sort of cat. They were normally fierce, but our temple cats all seemed to recognize me as a brother or something, because certainly I was as popular with them as they were with me. The Lama, who had been speaking to me before, turned to me saying, "Leave him be. He can rest on you while we talk to you. Perhaps he'll give you a good dig every so often to remind you to pay attention." Now, people see what they expect to see. Often they do not see that which is most obvious. For instance, he looked hard at me as he said this, how many cleaners were there in the corridor as you came along? Who was that man sweeping in the barley store? And if the Lord Abbot had sent for you and asked you to tell him if you'd seen anyone in the inner corridor, what would you have told him? He paused for a moment to see if I was going to make any remark, and as I just stared at him, open-mouthed, I'm afraid, he continued, "You would have said you saw no one in the corridor, because the person who was in the inner corridor was a person who has every right to be there, who is always there, and who would be so correct in that corridor that you would not even notice him. So you'd say you saw no one in that corridor." Another Lama broke in, nodding his head wisely as he added his piece. The proctors often have some difficulty when they're carrying out an investigation. They may ask us if there were any strangers, or if anyone had been in a certain building, and invariably a custodian of the building would say, no one had been in, and yet there might have been a procession of people. There would have been proctors passing by. There would have been perhaps a Lama or two, and there might even be a messenger from another lamasery. But because these people were so common, that is, because it's so usual for them to be in the vicinity, their passage would be unnoticed, and as far as being observed, they might just as well have been invisible. One who had not yet spoken nodded his head. Yes, that is so. Now I ask you, Lobsang, how many times have you been in this temple, and yet by your look, quite recently you had not seen the stand upon which we rested the crystal. That stand has been here for about 200 years. It has not been out of this temple, and yet you looked at it as if you were seeing it for the first time. It was here before, but it was commonplace to you, therefore it was invisible. The Lama, who had been with me on my astral trip through the Potala, smiled as he continued. You, Lobsang, had no idea of what was happening. You did not know you were going to be out of the body, therefore you were not prepared to see your body. Thus, when you looked at lamas sitting in a circle, and your attention carefully avoided your own body. We get the same thing in hypnotism. We can hypnotize a person to believe that he is completely alone in a room, and then that person in a state of hypnosis will look everywhere in a room except at the person who shares the room with him. And the hypnotized person, on being awakened, would take an oath to the effect that he had been alone. Well, in the same way, you carefully avoided looking at where your body was in plain view. Instead, you looked around the perimeter of the circle. You looked around the temple, avoiding the one spot that you thought you wanted to see. It really made me think. I had heard something like that before. I had once seen an old monk who had had a bad attack of migraine. As he explained it to me afterwards, things at which he looked were not there. If he looked at a thing in front of him, he could only see things at the side, but if he looked towards the side, he could see things in front of him. He told me it was like looking through a pair of tubes placed over the eyes, so that in effect he was as one wearing blinkers. A Lama, I did not know one from the other then, said, "The obvious often might be invisible, because the more common an object, the more familiar an object, the less noticeable it becomes. Take the man who brings barley. You see him every day, and yet you do not see him. He's such a familiar figure that had I asked you who came along here this morning, you would say no one, because you would not regard the barley carrier as a person, but just as something that always did a certain thing at a specified time. It seemed most remarkable to me that I should be lying on the ground, but then be unable to see my own body. However, I had heard so much about hypnotism and astral traveling that I was quite able to accept their explanation. The old wizened Lama smiled at me as he remarked, "We shall soon have to give you more specific instruction so that you can leave your body easily at any time. Like everyone else, you have been doing astral traveling every night, traveling off to distant places and then forgetting about it, but we want to show you how easy it is for you to get out of your body at any time at all and go on to an astral journey and then return to your body, retaining the full knowledge of all that you've seen and all that you have done. If you can do that, you can travel to the great cities of the world, and you will not be isolated here in Tibet, but can acquire a knowledge of all cultures." I thought about that. I had wondered often how some of our higher lamas seem to have all knowledge. They seem to be beings apart, being remote from the pettiness of everyday life, being able to say what was happening at any moment in any part of our country. I remembered on one occasion I, with my guide, had called upon an old man. I had been presented to him, and we had been talking, or rather my guide and he had been talking, and I had been respectfully listening. Suddenly the old man had held up his hands, saying, "I am called." Then he had withdrawn. The light seemed to go out from his body. He sat there immobile, looking like a dead man, looking like an empty shell. My guide sat quite still and motioned for me also to be still and quiet. We sat together with our hands clasped in our laps. We sat there without speaking, without moving. I watched what appeared to be the empty figure with vast interest for perhaps 10, maybe 20 minutes. It was difficult to gauge time under those circumstances, and nothing happened. Then there was the color of animation returning to the old man. Eventually he stirred and opened his eyes, and then, I shall never forget it, he told my guide exactly what was happening at Shigatse, which was quite some way from us. It occurred to me that this was far better as a system of communication than all the remarkable devices I had heard of in the outside world. I wanted to be able to astral travel anywhere. I wanted to be able to move across the mountains and across the seas and into foreign lands. And these men, these 9 lamas, were going to teach me. The old cat yawned, making his whiskers vibrate, and then he stood up and stretched until I almost thought he'd break in two. Then he strolled off, arrogantly pushing his way between 2 lamas, and disappeared into the darkness behind one of the sacred figures. The old wizened lama spoke, saying, "Well, it is time we brought this session to an end, for we did not come here to teach labsang on this occasion. This is just an incidental. We must set about our other work, and we will see labsang again when his guide returns." Another one turned to me and gave me a hard stare. "You will have to learn very carefully, labsang. You will have a lot to do in life. You will have hardships, suffering, and you will travel far and often. But in the end, you will achieve that which is your task. We will give you the basic training." They rose to their feet, picked up the crystal, leaving the stand, and left the temple. I sat wondering. A task, hardship, but I'd always been told I'd have a hard life ahead of me. Always been told that I had a task, so why did they rub it in so? Anyhow, why did I have to do the task? Why was I always the one to have suffering? The more I heard about it, the less I liked it. But I did want to travel in the astral and see all the things I had heard about. Gingerly, I climbed to my feet, wincing and muttering unkind words as the pain shot through my legs again. Pins and needles, and then a few bumps and bruises where I had fallen down a few times, and a pain between my shoulder blades where I had been resting upon my bowl. Thinking of that, I reached inside my robe and sorted my possessions into their accustomed position. Then, with a final look around, I left the temple. At the door, I hastily turned and went back to the flickering butter lamps. One by one I snuffed them out, for that was my duty. I was the last one to leave, therefore I was the one to snuff out the lamps. As I felt my way through the darkness to where there was a faint glimmer from the open door, my nostrils were assailed by the stench of smouldering wicks. Somewhere off in a corner there was the dying red ember of a wick, which was just then charring into blackness. I stood for a moment at the door, deciding which way I would go. Then, with my mind made up, I turned and made my way to the right. The bright starlight was pouring in through the windows, imparting a silvery blue appearance to everything. I turned a corner into the corridor and stopped suddenly, thinking, yes, of course, they were right. I stood there for a moment and thought. It occurred to me that time after time I had passed an old monk sitting in a little cell, and yet, although I saw him every day, I had never even noticed him. I retraced my steps for perhaps 10 yards and peered in. There he was, in a little stone cell on the far side of the corridor, opposite the windows. He was blind. Endlessly he sat there on the floor, turning a prayer wheel. Rather a big one it was. Turning, turning, turning. Whenever anyone passed by, there was the eternal click, click, click of the old monk's prayer wheel. Hour after hour, day after day, he sat there, believing that it was his allotted task in life to keep that prayer wheel turning. And that was all he lived for. We who passed that way so often were immune to the turning of the wheel. We were so accustomed to it that we neither saw the old monk nor heard his wheel a click. I stood there in the dark doorway and pondered as the wheel clicked on, and as the old man softly droned, Om Mani Padme Om, Om Mani Padme Om. His voice was hoarse, and his fingers were twisted and gnarled. I could make him out but dimly, and he was quite oblivious of me, turning the wheel, as often as he had turned the wheel for so many years, turning it long before I was born. How much longer will he turn it, I wondered. But it pointed out to me that people were invisible if we were so familiar with them that we did not notice them. It occurred to me, too, that sounds were silences if one became too accustomed to them. I thought of the times when I had been quite alone in a dark cell, and then, after a time, I would hear the gurgle and rustle of body sounds, the blood surging through the veins and arteries of the body, and then I would hear the steady thud, thud, thud of my heart pumping away. After a time, too, I could actually hear the air sighing through my lungs, and when I moved, the slight creak and snap of muscles pulling bones to a different position. We all have that. We are all noisy contraptions, I thought, and yet, when there are other sounds which attract our attention, we just do not hear those with which we are constantly surrounded and which do not obtrude. I stood on one leg and scratched my head, and then I thought that night was already far advanced. Soon there would come the call to temple service at midnight. So I hesitated no more, but put both feet on the ground, pulled my robe more tightly around me, and moved off up the corridor to the dormitory. As soon as I lay down, I fell asleep. Sleep was not long, my companion. I twisted and turned and creaked and groaned as I lay and thought of life as it was in a lamasery. About me, boys wheezed and muttered in their sleep, the sound of their snores rising and falling on the night air. One boy, who suffered from adenoids, was making a glubble, 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 until in desperation I rose and turned him on his side. I lay on my back, thinking and listening. From somewhere came the monotonous click, click of a prayer wheel as some monk endlessly twirled it so that his prayers could go winging forth. From afar came the muted clop clop as someone rode a horse up the path outside our window. The night dragged on. Time stood still. Life was an eternity of waiting, waiting, where nothing moved, where all was still, save for the snores, the click of the prayer wheel, and the muffled steps of a horse. I must have dozed. Wearily I sat up. The floor was hard and unyielding. The cold of the stone was creeping into my bones. Somewhere a boy muttered that he wanted his mother. Stiffly I climbed to my feet and moved to the window, carefully avoiding the sleeping bodies around me. The cold was intense, and there was a threat of snow to come. Over the vast Himalayan ranges, the morning was sending forth tendrils of light, colored fingers seeking our valley, waiting to light up yet another day. The spume of snow dust, always flying from the very highest peaks, was illumined now by golden light shining on its underside, while from the top came scintillating rainbow crescents, which wavered and blossomed to the vagaries of the high winds. Across the sky shot vivid beams of light as the sun peeped through the mountain passes and gave a promise of another day soon to be. The stars faded. No longer was the sky a purple vault. It lightened and became the palest blue. The whole of the mountains were limned with gold as the sky grew brighter. Gradually, the blinding orb of the sun climbed above the mountain passes and shone forth in blazing glory into our valley. The cold was intense. Ice crystals fell from the sky and cracked on the roof with a musical tinkle. There was a bitterness, a sharpness in the air that almost froze the marrow in one's bones. What a peculiar climate, I thought. Sometimes too cold to snow, and yet sometimes at midday it would be uncomfortably hot. Then in the twinkling of an eye, a great windstorm would rise up and send all flying before it. Always in the mountains there was snow, deep snow, but on the exposed stretches the winds blew away the snow as fast as it fell. Our country was high and with rarefied air so thin and clear that it afforded scant shelter from the ultraviolet, or heat-generating, rays of the sun. In our summer, a monk could swelter miserably in his robes, and then, as a cloud momentarily obscured the sun, the temperature would fall to many degrees below freezing, all in a few minutes. We suffered greatly from windstorms. The great barrier of the Himalayas sometimes held back clouds that formed over India, causing a temperature inversion. Then howling gales would pour over the mountain lips and storm down into our valley, sweeping all before it. People who wandered abroad during the storms had to wear leather face masks or risk having the skin stripped from them by the rock dust torrenting down, wind-borne from the highest reaches. Travelers caught in the open on the mountain passes would risk being blown away unless they were alert and quick to act. Their tents and other possessions would be blown in the air, whirling ragged and ruined, playthings of the mindless wind. Somewhere below, in the pale morning, a yak bellowed mournfully. As if at the signal, the trumpets blared forth from the roof high above. the conches lowed and throbbed to echo and re-echo and fuse into a medley of sound, like some multiple chord played on a mighty organ. About me there were all the myriad sounds of a large community awakening to a new day, to another day of life. A chant from the temple, the neighing of horses, muttered grumbles from sleepy small boys, shivering naked in the intense cold air. And, as a muted undertone, the incessant clicking of the prayer wheels located through the buildings, turned and turned eternally by old monks who thought that was their sole purpose in life. The place was astir. Activity increased from moment to moment. Shaven heads peered hopefully from open windows, wishing for a warmer day. A dark blob, shapeless, formless, wobbled from somewhere above and crossed my line of vision to crash with a sharp crack on the rocks below. Someone's bowl, I thought. Now he will have to go without breakfast until he can obtain another. Breakfast? Of course, we have started another day, a day when I would need to have my strength up, because I was hoping that my beloved guide would be returning this day. And before I could see him, there were morning classes, temple service, but before all, breakfast. Sampa is an unappetizing stuff, but it was all I knew about, except for very rare, very infrequent delicacies from India. So I trudged off down the corridor, following the line of boys and monks wending their way down to the hall where we ate. At the entrance I hung about a bit, waiting for some of the others to settle down, because I was shaky on my legs, somewhat uncertain in my steps, and when everyone was milling about, it posed a definite threat to my stability. Eventually I walked in and took my place among the lines of men and boys sitting on the floor. We sat cross-legged, all except me, and I sat with my legs tucked under me. There were lines of us, perhaps 250 of us at one time. As we sat there, monk attendants came and ladled out sampa, passing along the rows, giving each of us our fair, equitable share. Monks stood at the sides of each row, and then, at a given signal, they all went between our ranks with our food. No one could eat, though, until the attending master gave the signal. At last, each monk and boy had his bowl full of sampa. The attendants stood by at the side. An old lama walked to the lectern, a lectern raised up high above us so that he could look down upon us. He stood there and lifted the top sheet off his book, for our pages, remember, were long things not bound together as in the Western style. This lama lifted off the top sheet and then signaled that he was ready to start. Immediately, the attending master raised his hand and brought it down as a signal for us to start our meal. As we did so, the lector commenced his reading from the sacred books, his voice droning on and on, seeming to echo around the place, and making much of what he said unintelligible. Around the dining hall, the ever-present proctors padded silently, making no sound save for the occasional swish of their robes. In the lamaseries throughout Tibet, it was the fixed custom that a lector should read to us while we ate, because it was considered wrong for a person to eat and think of food. Food was a gross thing, merely necessary to sustain the body so that it could, for a little while, be inhabited by an immortal spirit. So although it was necessary to eat, yet we were not supposed to get pleasure from it. The lector read to us always from sacred books, so that while our bodies had food for the body, our spirit had food for the soul. The senior lamas always ate alone, most times thinking of some sacred text or looking at some sacred object or book. It was a very great offense to talk while eating, and any unlikely wretch caught talking was hauled forth by the proctors and made to lie across the doorway, so that when everyone left they had to step across the recumbent figure, and that brought much shame to the victim. We boys were always the first to finish, but then we had to keep quiet until all the others had finished. Often the lector would go on reading, quite oblivious of the fact that everyone was waiting for him. Often we would be made late for classes because the lector, getting absorbed in his subject, would forget time and place. At last the lector finished his page and looked up with some start of surprise, and then half turned to the next page, but instead he put the cover on the book and tied the tapes together. Lifting the book off, he handed it to a monk attendant, who took it, bowed, and removed the book for safekeeping. The attending master then gave the signal for us to dismiss. We went to the side of the hall where there were leather bags of fine sand, and with a handful of sand we cleaned out our eating bowls, the only utensils we had, because of course we used our fingers, the oldest utensil of all, and had no use for knives or forks. Lapsang, Lapsang, go down to the master of paper and get me 3 sheets which can have been spoilt on one side. A young lama stood before me, giving me the order. I muttered grumpily and stumped off down the corridor. This was one of the types of jobs I hated. Because of this particular thing, I would have to get out of the patala and go all the way down to the village of Show, where I would have to see the master printer and get the paper desired. Paper is very, very expensive in Tibet. It is, of course, absolutely handmade. Paper is treated as a minor religious object because nearly always it was used for sacred knowledge, sacred words. Thus, paper was never abused and never thrown away. If in printing a book the print was smeared, the paper was not scrapped, but the unspoiled side was available for teaching us boys. There was always a plentiful supply of spoiled paper for such purposes, because we printed from hand-carved wooden blocks, and of course a block had to be carved in reverse so that it could print the right way about. Thus, in trying out the blocks, there were inevitably many sheets of paper spoiled. I made my way out of the patala, going down by the lower back entrance, where the way was very steep but much shorter, and where there were no steps to tire my legs. Here, by the lower back entrance, we boys would go down, lowering ourselves from bush to bush, or if we missed our footing, we would skate down on a cloud of dust and wear a great hole in the seat of our robes, a matter which was difficult to explain later. I went down the narrow, narrow path with the overhanging bushes. At a small clearing I stopped and peered out in the direction of Lhasa, hoping to see a very special Saffron Robe coming across the turquoise bridge, or possibly, what joy the thought brought, coming along the ring road. But no, there were only the pilgrims, only the stray monks and an ordinary lama or two. So with a sigh and a grunt of disgust I continued my slithering path downwards. At last I arrived down by the courts of justice and made my way around to the back to the printing office. Inside there was an old monk. He seemed to be all smeared up with ink, and his thumb and forefingers were absolutely spatulate with handling paper and printing blocks. I went and looked about, for the smell of the paper and the ink always fascinated me. I looked at some of the intricately carved wooden boards which were going to be used for printing new books, and I rather looked forward to the time when I should be able to take a hand at carving, because it was quite a hobby of mine, and we monks were always given opportunities of displaying our skills for the good of the community. "Well, boy, well, what do you want? Quick, and what is it?" The old printer monk was looking at me severely, but I knew him of old. His bark was definitely worse than his bite. In fact, he was rather a nice old man who was merely scared the small boys were going to crumple precious sheets of paper. Quickly, I gave my message to the effect that I wanted 3 sheets of paper. He grunted in reply, turned away and peered, and peered, and peered, and looked as if he could not bear to give away his loved pieces of paper. He looked at each sheet and kept on changing his mind. In the end, I got tired of it and picked up 3 sheets, saying, "Thank you, honorable printer, I have these 3 sheets, they will do." He spun around and looked at me with his mouth wide open, a picture of stupefaction. By that time I had reached the door, complete with 3 sheets, and when he recovered his wits enough to say anything, I was out of hearing. Carefully I rolled the 3 sheets so the spoiled surface was outside. Then I tucked it into the front of my robe and made my way up again, pulling myself hand over hand by the hardy bushes. At the clearing I stopped again. Officially it would have been to regain my breath, but actually I sat upon a rock and looked for some time in the direction of Sarah, the wild rose fence. But no, there was just the ordinary traffic, nothing more. Possibly a few more traders than usual, but not the one I desired to see. At last I got to my feet and continued my journey upwards, going again through the little door and searching for the young lama who had sent me. He was in a room by himself, and I saw that he was composing. Silently I held out the 3 sheets to him, and he said, "Oh, you have been a long time. Have you been making the paper?" He took them without a word, and without a word of thanks. So I turned and left him, and made my way up to the classrooms, thinking that I would have to fill the day in some way until my guide returned. End of chapter 8.